Going beyond the headlines. Asking the questions you want answered. Exploring government policies and how they impact you. We are delving deeper.
Good evening and welcome to Delving Deeper. I'm your host, Kimberly D'Souza. Now, as we are all aware, the budget will be read on September 26th. And so joining me to talk more about this is Economist Dr. Seerattan. Dr. Seerattan, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening. Happy to be here.
Of course. Now, when that budget is read on September 26th, it's probably fair to say that people are going to be listening to the major announcements, specifically the one that directly affect their pockets. But what else should we probably be looking at?
The amount of money allocated in the budget with respect to wages and salaries, of course, would signal to the population, what is the position the government is taking in terms of those wage negotiations and so on. Of course, the figure that has been put forward is 4% in terms of the CPO offering public sector workers. And that, of course, we can discuss the whether that is a suitable amount in the context of what is going on in the economy and the global economy, specifically with respect to commodity prices, food prices, and those sorts of things.
Now, with the 4% that was offered, do you think that the government can afford a 4% or even more than 4%?
The 4% is the government should be able to afford, given the higher energy prices. The second thing is that we have to recognize that it is a permanent increase in government expenditure across the board going forward, even if energy prices fall. And thirdly, that we should pay a lot of attention to the different categories of workers, trying to do more for the lower income individuals who are the people who most at risk of falling into financial difficulties, because as you know, people who are on the lower income spectrum, they spend upwards of 80% of their income on essentials, food, medicine, transport.
So question for you, Doctor. The amalgamated workers, they accepted the 4%.
Right.
So was that a good decision for them, given, where they may lie in terms of that spectrum that you were talking about?
But even in amalgamated, there will be managers who will be getting a much higher amount, and there will be people at the bottom of the spectrum, blue-collar workers and so on, who are getting much lower income. So as I said before, I think 4%, sometimes when we discuss this average amount, 4% is doesn't really do justice to the complexities of the different categories of workers and how vulnerable they are, given all that has happened in the last 2 years, right? So I think we have to get away from these simple discussions about the average amount to talk about the different categories of workers and the different arrangements that could be made for people at the lower income spectrum, probably in the context of the tax regime, in terms of allowances and so on, to put these people in a better position, because all over the world, this is a concern for government. That's why you see around the region some governments putting caps on different types of commodities like food and essentials, medicine, and so on. Right? There's a recognition that the people at the lower end of the income spectrum have suffered the most. And if you look at poverty rates around the world as well, poverty rates have gone up. And the people who tend to fall into poverty when these shocks occur tend to be people at the lower income spectrum. The individuals who are middle income or definite and high income, they will feel their standard of living is likely to be lower. You can't spend as much money as you used to, but their minimum level of wealth here is not going to suffer that much. But,
well, then another question for you, Doc, because I know that, for example, Tutor, right? Of course, you would have seen what would have happened Monday when they took their day of rest and reflection just to send that message to government. One of the things that the president of Tutor was saying is that they don't calculate their rate or the increase by a percentage. They look at things like your skill set and that sort of thing. Can that enter the conversation now as we're looking at wage negotiation? Should we not break it down to that 4%, 6%, but look at another way where we can talk about wage negotiations?
I think the wage negotiations, especially for the public sector, have to be a little more nuanced. So, for example, just talking and arguing about an average 4% across the board probably does not do justice to the inherent differences between different categories of workers. So, we traditionally have not been as sophisticated in terms of our wage negotiation in Trinidad and Tobago. But things like, for example, focusing on the 4% is, as I said, a misnomer. You should focus on things like the different categories of workers, whether a particular category of worker might need an additional increase, whether we make adjustments for productivity increases. So particular categories of workers who have produced more, whether we have an agreement where based on certain metrics, you have an amount of money that goes to these people who perform better and so on. Difference of opinions in terms of the low-income people needing more support. And therefore, doing something better for the low-income people within a certain segment, whether it be central government or the state enterprise sector and so on, should not be that difficult. And therefore, I think that is the kind of discussion we should be having in the country, because the essence of these wage negotiations and the wage increases is to ensure that everybody's standard of living does not is at least maintained, and you try to prevent significant problems emerging in terms of poverty and things such as there's something called the working poor in countries where people are full-time employed, but they still cannot make ends meet in terms of meeting all their daily needs in terms of food, shelter, educating their children, having good medical care, and all those kinds of things. So we can't just talk about the average amount. We have to know where people are in terms of their levels of vulnerability and try to find a way to ensure that the wage increases at least bring them up to a certain minimum standard of living.
Now, Dr. Seerattan, I like that we bring the low-income class, because I also want to bring the middle class as well, because I know that inflation is just under 5%. Right. So how is that going to impact those low and middle-class households?
The inflation rate now is about 5%, but if you look at the average from 2017 coming forward, the rate of inflation on average, it has been very low. So the average is about 1.3, between 1.3 and 1.5%, which is extremely low for given our historical antecedents and so on. So based on the average rate of inflation alone, the government might be in a strong position with a 4%, right? But again, given the nuances and the inherent complexity in terms of different levels of vulnerability based on the type of employment you are in, your average income, the amount of dependence you have, how many children you have, and so on. All these things need to be factored in, because at the end of the day, I think everybody in Trinidad and Tobago want to ensure that our fellow citizens have a certain minimum standard of living, because that has implications for social and political stability.
But so then, Doctor, are you saying that we're in a lose-lose situation? Because are we saying that then that the 4% may not be enough to cover the essentials, services or necessities for the lower and middle income class? But then if we increase the 4%, this is going to be a constant line item for the government to have to expand. So is there any sort of leeway, any sweet spot in between where we can service the low and middle, and then we can also have that expenditure that the government can afford to put out every year?
Well, I think, to say the Minister of Finance must have a number in mind in terms of what he can afford. And I'm saying within that global figure, we make adjustment and we negotiate in a way that gives relatively more to the lower income groups and probably less to the higher income groups. I have made this point with some of my friends and colleagues is we have in Trinidad and Tobago relatively, in terms of our peers in the region, the taxation rate, especially for high income earners and so on. I personally would not mind paying more tax so that fellow citizens on the low income spectrum is in a better place, because people fail to realize we are all interconnected. We live in the same country. And you cannot think of yourself in isolation and your own welfare in isolation. You have to think about what minimum level of welfare is acceptable to the country, because at the end of the day, economic policy is about making people's lives better and is about the kind of country we want to live in. And if you have perspective about only about talking about numbers without reflecting on how that impacts on the lives and the well-being and the kind of country that we develop, then we are missing the essential point about all this discussion about economics and about prudent fiscal policy and about wage negotiations and so on and so on. All these things are means to an end, right? And we sometimes forget what the end is. And the end is ensuring that our people have adequate standard of living. And in that context, we always have to be more concerned about people at the lower income spectrum.
Well, let's look at the budget deficits. It's the lowest it has been in years. Can we expect that same trend moving into fiscal 2023?
The energy commodity prices, especially energy prices, are inherently volatile. And when they correct, they normally overshoot what economists call overshoot. So if the price goes up to 106 and then the market is correcting, it never comes down to some equilibrium that equilibrates demand and supply, because we have things in the energy market where you have speculation and so on, and the price normally overshoots. So when it goes up, it normally goes up higher than it needs to go up. And when it goes down, it normally goes lower than the equilibration of the demand and supply requires, right? So that builds in a kind of inherent volatility in energy prices. So given that we are so dependent on the energy sector, we have to be cognizant of these kinds of things and try as much as possible, while we try to meet the needs of especially our most vulnerable, ensure that we don't do things that put us in a position down the road where you might have to cut in a way that again negatively impacts on the welfare of the most vulnerable, right? So again, it's a very difficult situation, huh? And countries have been grappling with these challenges for a relatively long period. I mean, to say COVID and the Russian-Ukraine war is the latest shock, but a lot of economies in the Caribbean was basically still trying to recover or still suffering from some of the legacy of the global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008 and the impact of the CL financial crisis in 2009 when the COVID-19 pandemic struck. And then as we were just emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of what was going on in the global economy, the Russian-Ukraine war occurred. So who knows what other shock you're going to experience down the road, and therefore it's prudent to think about what long-term conditions we are going to face. And the Minister of Finance have to deal with the pressures now for wage increases, but he also have to keep an eye on what is likely to happen down the road and ensure we don't overextend ourselves and find ourselves in a position where we have to institute more austerity and more difficult policy policies to correct and deal with shocks that we are going to be having to deal with down the road.
Now, Dr. Seerattan, I know that you're talking about 2023, 2024, but the Minister of Finance would have actually given a pretty positive outlook on the economy at the spotlight that was recently held. I mean, given what he discussed, what do you think are some of the areas that he should focus on as we look towards that new fiscal year?
I think, well, the government, as most government in the Caribbean have, you remember a lot of these things, all these policy issues and policy strategy is discussed at length when the IMF come visiting, right? And as you know, the IMF visits every member country every year during the Article 4 consultation. And I mean to say, if you look at some of the Article 4 consultation, and very interestingly, the discussion on policy and policy strategy, there's always a discussion about medium-term fiscal sustainability. So it is virtually impossible, even for large economies, to stabilize or to have fiscal to have nice fiscal accounts every year, right? Because of all the exigencies and all the problems that you face over periods of time. So the only logical and wise thing to do is to have balance, to try to balance over the medium term. we have been rationalizing, and we have been trying to stabilize for the last 3 years or so. We are fortunate enough to have energy prices increasing, so there's a little bit of breathing room. And now the minister could at least begin to deal with some of the legacy issues with respect to wages and things that we need to do for the most vulnerable. But having said that, again, in the context of how energy prices go, you have to be very, very careful. And I would make reference to what is going on in Sri Lanka. If you lose control, sometimes it may seem that it is kind of being mean not to acquiesce to some of the demands, very, very justifiable demands. But we live in a very dangerous world, a world that is very, very volatile. And you have to ensure that you manage your affairs in such a way that you always have buffers to meet the kinds of exigencies that happen all too frequently in the world that we live in.
But so I know that I'm hearing you, Doc, talking about things like, for example, the wages and the most vulnerable. So then are you saying that they should increase social grants, for example? I mean, how else, like what they should really, use this windfall, I would say, to focus on as we look forward to the next year?
Well, I think we have to look carefully at the most vulnerable, and these transfers and so on to vulnerable groups, whether they be poor households or people who are disabled and so on, is something that we at least have to try to sustain and see whether those grants can be increased if they have not been increased for a long period of time. But again, you remember, you have to, these things, when you make these changes and you increase them, is not as if it increases in 2000 and the fiscal year 2020, 2022, 2023, and then it goes back to normal, what it was before. It is a permanent increase, and these things are fixed costs that we have to sustain going forward, right? And if we are in a situation where it's likely that our income stream might decline over a period of time, we have to always have in our minds being able to stabilize the country over the medium term, right? So to put it in simple terms there, you obviously need to deal with these wage demands now, but you cannot go overboard in terms of trying to fix everything in 1 year, right? You remember there will be a next negotiation period. Probably the world economy will be in a better place then, and the Minister of Finance, whoever he or she is at that point in time, might be in a position where they could give something slightly better for people along the road. So you have to always think in these discrete time periods in terms of how you manage your affairs and so on. Always keeping in the back of your mind the knowledge that things, given what has happened in the global economy over the last 10 years, I mean to say, you have to err on the side of caution. The energy sector will always be a significant component of our productive system, but we need to have, for our own economic resilience, other sectors that could take up the slack whenever there are problems in the energy sector.
So then was there merit to the Agri-Investment Forum that we had a few weeks ago?
Of course, but you see, there are limits. There are limits to the extent to which agriculture could take up the slack, right? Because even if we produce more, the agriculture sector is more dynamic. And the agriculture sector, to me, is a very strategic sector because given the supply disruptions and so on that we have seen around the world, it even if we didn't want to promote the agriculture sector to be a significant sector in terms of producing income and employment and so on, from a national security point of view, in terms of food security, we need to boost up our agricultural production. And that has ramifications as well in terms of our forex situation, because as you know, we have a very high food import bill, and the very structure of consumption in the country means that we have a very high import intensity. So imports form a very high component of GDP. And therefore, anything we can do to reduce the import intensity in the country is going to have knock-on benefits in terms of our external resilience, as well as the strength or the resilience in the foreign exchange, in terms of foreign exchange dynamic. It means we'll need less hard currency every year for importation of food and so on, right?
So then how does the manufacturing sector factor into all of this?
Well, the manufacturing sector, we have had, since the early 90s, our manufacturing sector has been relatively dynamic. I mean, to say if you go up and down the Caribbean, a lot of our light manufacturing products in terms of beverages, in terms of food, and so on, you will see a lot of these products up and down the Caribbean, right? I think over time, we have needed to retool and so on in the manufacturing sector to catch up with some of the more efficient producers in Latin America. And even some of our Caribbean peers have made huge strides. Jamaica in particular have now a kind of very dynamic light manufacturing sector and so on. So, even in CARICOM, we have to kind of up our game, because people don't start, countries and people don't start still. So even though we were ahead of the game in the late 90s, early 2000s and so on, people will do things to catch up and so on. And we have to adjust the regime in place for trade facilitation in terms of things for encouraging more efficient manufacturing, production, and so on. We need to kind of do things to ensure that we keep pace with the people who we compete with and so on. And, there are many different things that the government could do with respect to those things, in terms of the ease of doing business, in terms of making our port facilities more efficient, and a whole host of different kinds of things that could make the life of people in manufacturing sector easier, right? And in many cases, these things are not some one major thing that you need to do. In many cases, when you talk to businessmen and so on, and you canvass their views in terms of the things that hold them back, is many different things. And a lot of them has to do with the efficiency in the public service.
I know that you have strongly opposed the valuing the TTE dollar, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
When you are dealing with economic policy, you're not only thinking about the arithmetic of these different policies you can implement, which includes what the exchange rate should be. You have to keep in mind the impact it's going to have on the welfare of people in the country, poverty levels, social and political stability, as well as in the manufacturing sector, because in the manufacturing sector and in the industry, a lot of the inputs, the intermediate inputs, are imported. So you have to really understand the structure of our economy and society to be able to make a determination about what might be an appropriate strategy. So that's one. The second thing is that the exchange rate is an economic variable that is subject to all kind of psychological factors. Economists talk about irrational exuberance when things are doing well, and people talk about fear and fear-mongering and panic when things are bad. So in the context, when you're dealing with foreign exchange issues and exchange rate issues, economists normally talk about what you do in the tranquil period or during good economic times, and in the volatile period when you have bad economic times. And we are in a period now where we are doing better, but we are still in a very dangerous period for a variety of reasons. The adjusting the exchange rate is not going to achieve all our economic objectives. It might actually make them worse. And secondly, is an issue of control. If you try to adjust the exchange rate or use the exchange rate more intensively to backstop your adjustment and your adjustment and stabilization efforts in a volatile period, or relatively a period when agents are very risk averse and they are very sensitive about what's going to happen and so on, you are likely to be creating more problems, because it's very difficult to control where the rate is going to be in that kind of scenario, right? Even with all the tools we have at our disposal at the central bank and in the Ministry of Finance. So it will be foolhardy to try to adjust now. I'm not saying that the exchange rate don't have a role to play sometime in the future, but you have to be very, very careful about the timing when you can use these things. And it's definitely not the time to use it now, because we are in a very difficult period where agents are very risk averse. And it's also not a good time to do it now, because we are already having discussions about vulnerability and the cost of living and so on. And guess what's going to happen if you go and adjust the exchange rate and to be depreciated? I mean to say, all prices are going to go through the roof. Then the unions are going to come back and they're definitely not going to be satisfied with 4%, right? And therefore, you set in motion a dynamic that you really don't have a lot of control over.
Now, Dr. Seerattan, as we listen to the Minister of Finance as he's preparing that budget for fiscal 2023, what do you think is at least one of the main challenges that he's going to be facing?
I think the main challenge undoubtedly is managing expectations, right? Because everybody could see that we are getting more revenues and the economy is slightly better. And given the pent-up legacy issues in terms of wage negotiations and so on, it's quite natural for unions to be lobbying for higher income, higher wages, and so on. But given the very fragile place where the global economy is still, and given our dependence on the energy sector, and given the inherent volatility in energy prices, we have to be careful that we, in settling the justifiable demands of the labor unions and so on and workers, you don't put the country in an unsustainable path moving forward in that medium-term sustainability framework I was mentioning. So the numbers, the average wage increase is something that we need to think about, because that has ramifications for how much it's going to cost now and in the future. And it also has ramifications for sustainability going forward, right? But we have to always keep at the back of our minds that we're in a very difficult period in the international economy still. And Trinidad and Tobago, although things are beginning to turn around slightly, that given the inherent volatility in energy prices, we always have to be sure that we don't go overboard and do things that reduce our buffers, create vulnerabilities that we will have to deal with down the road, and so on and so forth. I always tell people, we have to always think about intergenerational equity. So we don't want to be dealing with things now, and then 10 years down the road, our children have to be dealing with even more difficult problems because we didn't make prudent decision now. Okay, so these things, it's very complex. Once you understand how difficult a situation we are in terms of the global economy, and you understand the inherent complexity in a modern economy, it is not an easy thing. And one of the things I would recommend to the national community is that we should really have a kind of formal system in place for tripartite discussions, similar to what the Bajans have, in terms of labor, business, and the government sector sitting on a regular business to talk in a very rational way about how we could balance the different interests in terms of business, labor, and the government, right? Because too often we have this discussion in an environment that is characterized by everybody seeking their own interests, which is oftentimes not the best thing for the country, right? So some arrangement, formal established procedure for this tripartite discussion, similar to what the Bajans have, is something that we need to look into. And also to backstop that, we need to have some kind of non-partisan institution, something akin to a council, a national economic planning council, or any other thing that you will want to name it, that could backstop the work, the intellectual work that that kind of tripartite arrangement will require. Because you don't want to have a tripartite arrangement and then the intellectual work, the estimates and so on is done by the Ministry of Finance, because some of the interested parties like Labour might not be
too on board with it,
because they think that the Minister of Finance will fix the books to suit their purposes and so on. But if you have a mechanism that does all the intellectual work that people could see is a kind of independent entity, then it will add a certain level of confidence in the information that is being produced to backstop the tripartite discussions and so on.
Of course.
Yeah.
And Dr. Seerattan, I mean, given all that was discussed today, the trends that we're seeing, maybe even diversifying the economy, what do you think the economy is going to look like, or what do you expect is going to be, let's say, 6 to 12 months from now?
Well, the economy is that's the short term. So the economy is probably not going to look drastically different from what it is, right? So we are still going to be dominated. Our fortunes are still going to be wholly dependent on the energy sector. But I would think that people coming out of COVID and coming out of the supply chain problems that we had in terms of the availability of food and medicine and a number of different commodities and so on, a lot more attention is going to be paid to agriculture, and not from a vantage point necessarily of simply trying to boost up income and employment from that sector. That's one objective. But in terms of increasing our resilience to those shocks and being better able to feed ourselves, which feeds into a better national security, and so on and so forth. So that's the short term. But in the longer term, I think we have to pay a lot of attention to the tourism industry. The Caribbean already have a very good brand in the international tourism industry, and a lot of people don't think of us as the Caribbean, but we are in the southern tip of the Caribbean, and we could leverage that brand, that Caribbean brand, to push our tourism product. And a lot of people don't know, but tourism is one of the most resilient sectors. So after the 9/11 attacks, global tourism went down, but almost 9 months afterwards, back up. After the international financial crisis, tourism suffered, but very quickly it was back up. And I'm certain that after COVID, tourism suffered, but as you could see now with travel patterns and so on, especially in Trinidad and Tobago, everybody is in Miami or down the Caribbean and so on. The tourism industry has rebounded significantly. So it's a very resilient sector. And it's low-hanging fruit. What we need to do is put the architecture in place in terms of transport, in terms of the hotel stock, in terms of the natural environment. As somebody points out to me that, one of the biggest attributes in places like Barbados and the Bahamas is simply cleanliness, a clean environment without garbage and unsightly refuse and so on. So all these things we need to gear ourselves towards these kinds of things. So tourism is low-hanging fruit, but in the longer term, things like fintech, leveraging technology to produce more, to grow the services sector in terms of things like accounting, consultancy service, legal, and so on. Trinidad is blessed in terms of having a very good cadre of professionals and so on. We could leverage technology and that inherent human resource to make our way in the world in terms of export services and those kinds of things.
Nice. Well, Dr. Seerattan, thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of Delving Deeper. I really appreciate your insights and your thoughts. And of course, we look forward to that budget reading on September 26th.
No problem. My pleasure.
Join us at the same time next week for another edition of Delving Deeper. I am Kimberly D'Souza, and on behalf of our entire crew, have a good night.